Please be advised, Once Upon a Crime is a series depicting true crime incidents in South Africa. The content may not be suitable for sensitive listeners. Listener discretion is advised. The views and opinions expressed during Once Upon a Crime is not that of the SABC and Lotus FM. In today's case, two couples go on a walk in Rhodes Park in Johannesburg, which ends in absolute horror and devastation when their paths cross with a vicious gang of criminals who's not just happy to rob them and leave them be, but members of the group also insist on committing utterly vile acts of inhumanity. Two of the victims are rape survivors, and to comply with legal and ethical considerations, we've given all of the victims pseudonyms.
Rhodes Park in Johannesburg was established in 1897 when the area around it, called Kensington, was established. It was intended to be a bit of a pause area in the surrounding hustle and bustle of the city, somewhere for residents to relax and reconnect with nature. Over the years, the park has sometimes fallen into disrepair and has also become a safety concern. In 2015, when this case takes place, families still used Rhodes Park for picnics and outings during the day, and it was thought to still be safe enough for a dusk-timed stroll. But after this case, all of that would change.
On Saturday, the 17th of October 2015, two couples decided to go for an early evening walk. Zukisa and his wife Tembi and Sizwe and his wife Anna had been at a church event earlier in the day and were still dressed in their church clothes when they left their homes in Kensington. Zukisa and Tembi had left all their valuables at home, and only Sizwe had his cell phone on him as they set out on their walk. They were aware of the risk of being mugged everywhere, not just in Rhodes Park.
As the two couples were starting out on their walk, a group of men was gathering outside a hair salon in Yeovil. They'd been nursing a bottle of whiskey for some time, and they soon set out for Rhodes Park too. The men made their living mugging people, and although the original group's muggings had never really gotten violent, that night a second group of men had joined them, and the vibe within the gang had shifted. When the men arrived at the park that night, they found that there were some large groups of park users who were just packing up as dusk settled over the park. The men hid in the bushes and continued to drink, and soon they saw four people approaching on the footpath.
Within seconds, the two couples were surrounded. The large group of men shouted at their victims, disorientating and frightening them on purpose. Some of the assailants were armed with knives, and one had a replica gun, which would have looked very real to the victims in their confused and terrified state. When the four were told to lie down and then hand over their valuables, they complied quickly. But the men were unhappy with their haul, only a gold ring and a cell phone. Fury began to build up amongst some of them.
Over the next few minutes, a scene of horror played out, and it would be difficult to ascertain afterwards what had happened when. But both female victims were physically assaulted and raped by several of the men, while their husbands were forced to lay beside them. Then the men turned their attention to their husbands. The man who had seemed to take the lead in the group told the women that because they had no valuables, they were going to have to take blood instead. When this violence began, four of the men in the group ran away, but 8 remained, and they began to bind the male victims with pieces of clothing. Their hands and feet were bound, and then, horrifically, they were thrown into the middle of the lake. Neither Sizwe nor Zukisa could swim, and even if they could, their bindings prevented them, as did the mass of vegetation that grew at the bottom of Rhodes Park's body of water. It was a deadly combination. The gang of men laughed as the women cried and prayed for their husbands, until the surface of the lake was still and their cries were gone. A waiter at a nearby restaurant would be a hero that night, as he'd seen something strange was happening and called the police. Thankfully, they responded quickly, and as sirens filled the air, the assailants fled. The bodies of the 2 male victims would be pulled from the lake later that night by police divers.
I did the post-mortem examination on one of the male victims who, when I did the autopsy, was found to not be bound. This, of course, does not mean that he wasn't bound at the time when he was thrown into the water. The bindings could simply have come loose. There were also no other injuries on his body. But what I didn't remember distinctly is how neatly and smartly this victim was dressed. It's something that remains with me to this day. The findings in any drowning are typically very non-specific, and it's actually a very difficult diagnosis to make. In this case, his lungs were hyperinflated and covered the heart, meaning that they were overfilled with air. There were also rib impression marks over the surfaces of the lungs, as the lungs were expanding against the rigid chest as the deceased was trying to breathe. The lungs were edematous and congested, which means that the water and blood contents in the lungs were increased. Contrary to popular belief, there are no water filling the chest cavity in drownings. It's the findings in the lungs itself and the absence of other findings on which this diagnosis is based. The only other finding was that the organs were all congested, again meaning that the blood contents in the organs were increased. This is a typical, albeit non-specific finding in asphyxial death, which in layman's terms mean death due to a lack of oxygen. When I was presented with a history regarding this deceased, I remember, and I still feel this way, that this was absolute pure evil. The women having had to listen to the men drown, and the men having had to listen to the women being raped and assaulted.
This case would take a combination of excellent police work, helpful members of the public, a bit of street informant assistance, and targeted coverage from the media in order to solve it. 2 police detectives worked side by side to help solve this case. One, who was not officially assigned to the case, spent his days off just going door to door in the area, asking if anyone knew anything. And soon, this bore fruit, with the resident providing CCTV footage from outside his home, which showed a group of men running down the road around the time that this crime had occurred. Stills from the footage helped to identify one man, Thabo Nkala, through an informant network. The stills were also released to the media, and this, combined with a 100,000 Rand reward, led to several good leads.
Police always knew that it was going to be difficult to find all 12 men, and by early 2016 they had arrested 3 and decided to proceed to trial. Thabo Nkala, Edmond Ndlovu, and Mduduzi Lawrence stood trial, and when the female victims testified, they said that they were sure it had been Mduduzi Lawrence who had given the order for their husbands to be thrown into the lake. While the trial was ongoing, a 4th man would be found by officials in Zimbabwe, but after much deliberation, it was decided that it would be too expensive to have the trial again, so the man was released. In 2017, each of the 3 men were found guilty of 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of rape each. They were all handed down the same sentences of 4 life sentences each, 1 for each count. None of the other 9 men have ever been arrested or prosecuted for this horrendous crime.
Now, Nicole, you did mention that they didn't go to trial again because it was considered a little bit too expensive and perhaps they didn't have the money. But my question is, in the framework of South Africa, is this something that's common? Does this happen often where these trials don't happen because of the lack of funds and the lack of resources, perhaps?
Look, I've found in cases that I've covered that when there's a large number of offenders on the same crime, it's often very difficult to firstly find all of them, and secondly to prosecute all of them at the same time. As we saw with this case, the prosecution, I think quite rightly, decided to go ahead with prosecution on the 3 accused that they had. Because firstly of the trauma that the victims were going through, every month that they have to wait for a trial, even if it's not all 12 perpetrators, it's at least some form of justice for them. And that's not uncommon in South Africa. Our courts are very backlogged. As you mentioned, resources is a big issue. When some of these individuals were found to be, not from South Africa, so either migrants from Zimbabwe or other African countries. And, when that happens, these individuals may flee to those countries, and it costs money to bring them back, even though the distance isn't that far. So sometimes, unfortunately, justice has to be weighed up with the practical considerations of, do we spend much more time trying to find the rest of these 9 men and prosecute them? Or, if we've got the offenders we think did perhaps the most horrendous parts of the crimes and gave the orders for especially the murders and the rapes, then perhaps at least we're making a difference by, prosecuting these 3.
If I could maybe slot in, if you don't mind, the women were particularly traumatized. I remember that distinctly. And they required a lot of psychological support, both from SAPs and from psychologists. And they had to be counseled right throughout this entire process. And one of the police officers actually took them to court himself and really stood by them and assisted with helping them come to deal with this. So I think what Nicole said is quite true. You can't delay this indefinitely in the hopes of finding the other 9 men, which you might never do. I mean, this trial does need to go to get to a conclusion and get them some kind of justice at least.
Yes, absolutely. Now, Dr. van Staden, I'd like to ask you this question. You did share with us some of your findings a little earlier, but I think maybe the public may like to know, the viewers and the listeners, is that how would you figure out whether someone was killed and then put into the water versus someone that died from being in the water itself?
So drowning is a particularly difficult diagnosis to make because simply the fact that a body, and I don't want to give people ideas, but simply the fact that a body is in a body of water for a prolonged period of time can actually mimic the findings that one might find in a drowning as well. So it's often a diagnosis of exclusion, and one needs to determine firstly, did the person drown before they fell or were thrown or landed in the water, or did they actually die in the water? And even then you need to still decide, is it a natural or an unnatural death? So for example, did this person sit on the side of a motorboat and have a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, and then fall into the water? So they were basically dead from a natural disease before they entered the water. Were they, for example, shot, or did something else happen to them and the body was simply discarded in the water? So it's an unnatural death before being placed in the water. Did the person drown in the water, which is an unnatural death? Or was there some other unnatural occurrence in the water? So, for example, did a motorboat drive over the deceased and cause them injuries? Or were they, for example, in the water and then suffered a heart attack in the water, where you can also get the findings where the body becomes quite waterlogged and the fingers, for example, become like what we look like when we sit in the bath for too long a period of time, that wrinkly appearance. We call it a washerwoman's hands appearance. So obviously the other thing that could happen was, or is what we call hydrocussion, where somebody enters the water and this very cold water, especially if they've been using alcohol, could lead to a vasovagal attack where they die suddenly from exposure to the water. So it becomes a very technical discussion, and becomes very technical, especially since, like I said, the findings in drowning are very non-specific. So one needs to look at the lungs. Those are the most reliable. And sometimes you have to get to the point where you say the cause of death is unascertained, specifically if the person is quite decomposed, which fortunately in this case was not the case. But often bodies remain in water for a prolonged period of time, and by the time we get them, they are quite decomposed.
Well, thank you so much, ladies, for joining me on this episode. This is where we wrap up episode 6 of Once Upon a Crime here on the Night Café on Lotus FM. Join us again next week for another chilling episode.